Alexie, welcome to UCSD Guestbook.
Thanks.
I guess I'd like to start by asking you a little bit about your childhood.
I was small. I grew up on the Spokane Indian Reservation, a town called Walpanet, Washington, in eastern Washington State, right on the Idaho-Washington border. So I'm a res kid. Can still talk that way when I want to.
When you want to.
Yeah, so, and I grew up in a family, a fairly large family. We're Catholic and Indian, so guilt squared. And so there are 3 brothers, 3 sisters. My dad was the Catholic. My mom was sort of a Protestant Assembly of God's traditional Spokane, anti-Catholic, agnostic, atheist, pantheistic, Jesuit matriarch. So it was quite diverse. But my dad, more than Catholic, worshiped basketball. So George Mikan was his pope. So that's where I grew up.
So how did this mix of ethnicities, religions, small towns, eastern Washington end up shaping your artistic career?
Well, I think what it prepared me for was to always be the outsider on American culture. In some sense, I was an outsider on my reservation because I was immediately interested in all sorts of things people around me weren't. You know, I was reading very young, you know, reading literature very young, Steinbeck and Shakespeare and poetry and Pound and Eliot and Keats and Yeats, and sort of was looking that way from at a very early age. Part of that has to do with my dad was a serious reader. He was a genre reader. I mean, I was the world's youngest JFK conspiracy theorist, you know, get my little Legos out and do Dealey Plaza and have a Weeble for JFK, you know, back and to the left, back and to the left. And, but because I didn't fit in there, and because I didn't fit in the white world either, and I was always observing it. I mean, my reservation, unlike a lot of reservations, especially here in Southern California, is very much a monoculture. About 97% of the people who live on the Spokane Indian Reservation are Indian, and about 70% of those Indians are Spokane Indians. So it was a monoculture, and so I was always looking at the outside world, not a part of it, looking. And so in some sense, it prepared me to always be a witness to the various felonies and misdemeanors of American life.
It puts you in a very interesting situation within your own Spokane culture and also within sort of Indian culture in America in general, because you're sort of the outsider, you're the critic of both cultures, and I guess it gets you into trouble sometimes too.
Well, it's supposed to get me in trouble. That always amazes me. I guess part of it is because from a traditional standpoint, in Native communities, at least in the way we look at it, I don't know if it was true or not. You know, who knows what the role of the artist in Indian community was 400 years ago? Right. Who really knows? We don't know. We only have guesses. But traditionally speaking, you know, the artist was part of the life, the day-to-day life, so that, you know, the Indian storyteller 400 years ago was no important than the Indian medicine man or the Indian hunter or the Indian warrior. They were all sort of equal roles in this tribalistic, socialistic, communistic community. And the Western idea of the artist has always been someone very separate, someone who was always distanced away from the tribe, whatever that tribe might be, and was always looking at it rather than being a part of the tribe. So being an Indian writer or an artist of any form these days, 21st century USA, you're always working in 2 very mutually exclusive roles, as an Indian writer and as a writer, and there's a lot of conflicts, always. In some sense, artists always betray their tribes. So an Indian artist's betrayal is exponentially worse.
That's an interesting concept. I mean, in one sense, you have, you know, the role, and we don't know, as you said, exactly what it was like, but the sort of contrary person who was built into Indian society and played a defined role where the that definition of an Indian artist didn't quite fit in. But you also have the role of being an artist in the sort of Western sense. How do you think how do you have your art sort of speak to both audiences at the same time, as both critic, insider, and outsider?
Well, you know, I don't know about audience. You can never predict that. You don't know. You know, I first published my first book of poems from Hanging Loose Press, this tiny little press in Brooklyn, New York. You know, with 2 Jews, an Irishman, and a mutt, you know, how do you know that this little Indian boy's book's going to go where? And I thought, you know, I'd sell 200 copies, 196 to my mom. So I've never really figured out what the audience is, except that the audience for literature in this country is in fact, for books, period, is about 70% middle-class white women. Mm-hmm. So, you know, we're all talking to middle-class white women. That's our job. So, you know, that's my audience.
No, but in one hand, you do all sorts of things. You do poetry, you've done music, you do film scripts, all sorts of projects besides the novels and the short stories. That's a tremendous amount of versatility, and clearly you've established an audience for all those things. So you must have some idea of what ties all those various art forms together in your mind.
An obsessive compulsive disorder.
Okay, well that's sort of a good way to start.
Every story finds its way of being told. I just never wanted to feel limited. You know, I'm not limited in what I enjoy to read or watch. You know, I watch every high art, low art, pop art. I read everything from murder mysteries to, you know, esoteric literary theory. I watch everything from, you know, Friends to, you know, John Cassavetes movies, and I read everything from comic books to the latest, you know, romance novels. So, I mean, hunger is my crime, and I don't want to exclude myself from writing in all of these genres that I also love to read.
The other thing that strikes me, and I think you've said it before, is that there's something about your art in particular, and in some ways Indian artists as a genre, that is inherently political. Although, as you've also said before, you don't like to beat people over the head with it. But
I said that? I don't know. I like beating people over the head.
Okay, but you said you didn't. You said you didn't beat people over the head.
No, I think I like to make them laugh first, and then beat them over the head.
And that's probably a very good way of doing it.
Yeah, they're defenseless.
But at the base there's I wonder whether you think or whether you feel that there is a responsibility among non-Indians, in a sense, to understand the Indian voice and how you approach that.
You know, I'm trying harder and harder, and as the years go by, not to separate the work that way. You know, we spend our lives trying to prove, Indians and Indian writers trying to prove that we're part of American culture, but we don't need to prove it. We already are. You know, our culture, our stories, our lives influence American life on a minute-by-minute basis. And it's not that it doesn't exist, it's people's refusal to recognize it. I mean, whenever you say the name of a town anywhere in this country, you're saying an Indian word.
Particularly in the West. Yeah.
Yes, and when you repeat that word, you know, there's so much context and subtext and history in that word that our lives and stories are everywhere. So I don't feel separate from that.
Right, and actually I was asking the question in reverse, which is sort of how does one make people in this country a little bit more self-conscious about the way they use those things?
I don't know, and I don't really care. It's not my job, you know. My job is to write and tell stories, and whatever happens after that I have no control over, and I don't have the ego or the insecurity to care. I mean, I have plenty of ego and plenty of insecurities, but not in that way. As the career's gone on, I just realized there's no way you can predict what happens with stories, and that's the great part. You know, that's the excitement of standing up in front of who knows who comes to your readings. You never know. I mean, these days I have a big enough career to where 5,000 people show up, right? But also, I'm a literary writer, so sometimes 50 people show up. You never know, and you never know the demographics. Sometimes it's, you know, 70% brown faces. Sometimes it's 100% white faces. You know, so it's the excitement of telling stories and the way in which the demographics of the audience change the way I feel about the evening, change the way the story gets told. It's an interpretation. I mean, you take, for example, like Smoke Signals, the movie we made. It changed radically depending on the audience.
Absolutely.
I mean, we screened it in Minnesota at the university, and the crowd was about 75% Indian. Mm-hmm. And sound on the film kept breaking down. But there was enough Indians in the crowd who had seen the movie enough times that they started filling in the dialogue. So it was like Rocky Horror Indian Picture Show, and you know, it was amazing. And yet, I've also been in theaters where it was screened for 100% white audiences in the East Coast, where nobody laughed through the entire movie.
Even, yeah.
Not one joke was understood or interpreted as a joke. And we screened it on my reservation. And we had to play it immediately a second time because people laughed so much during the first screening that they missed out on the story. You know, everybody yelling, "Ah, there's my cousin," and cameo appearances. So that's the joy of storytelling, and the pain and agony and the magic and loss of it, that it changes all the time, and it's kinetic. And you know, and as much as we attempt to define it, it's useless.
Well, let me ask you about Smoke Signals. That's one more story about audience, and we can beat this dead horse once more. Because, I mean, it's an interesting movie in all sorts of ways, and also as an Indian-made movie that was released by a sort of major Hollywood house, it also broke new ground. And it was a success. It made money. So in all respects, you know, you have the setup for Hollywood saying, wow, there's more here than, you know, we've thought of in terms of sort of real Indian-made pictures. But do you think they actually?
Not at all.
Do you think they get it?
No. Well, there's no getting it or not getting it. That's not even the issue. The issue is this going to make enough money for us to make this movie? It has nothing to do with whether they get it or not.
Right, but then they make more if there is enough, and there was
no. According to their definitions and their pie charts and graphs and formulas, no. Smoke Signals wasn't enough of a success. And moreover, I think that even though it was one of the most successful independent movies of 1998, in the top 5 money-wise, and for gross compared to budget, one of the most successful movies of the year, period. But because it is filled with Indians and is an Indian stories, it does have a ceiling. It does have an economic ceiling. And because it has an economic ceiling, I mean, I guarantee you there's no movie about Indians ever going to break out and make $50 or $100 million.
And that's what they're looking for.
Yeah, it's never. There's no movie going to win that lottery. I'd be amazed if one did. I'd be so happy, but it's not going to happen, and they know that.
Well, then that brings us back to your stories, which are the core of the whole thing. What goes into thinking through what you want to talk about? Is it something that just comes out? Is it something that you reach for? Is it something that develops over years?
I have no idea.
Something that happens quickly?
I have no idea. You know, I could lie. You know, I could tell you some stories about how it works. You know, oh, I sit there and wait for the muse to come.
There you
go. I work my ass off. You know, I sit in front of the computer and pound away, or with my notebook and write away. You know, it's about manual labor.
Yeah, and I think that's actually the message about artists, that it's manual labor.
Yeah, it's nothing ethereal, right. And nothing gets me madder than some writer or artist sitting on a program like this and getting all esoteric and ethereal about the process, like they have been chosen by the gods to tell these stories. No, I work just as hard as NFL linebacker or a plumber or a police officer. You know, and I think you'll find that the more successful the writer, the harder they work. Right. Yeah. As in any field. Yeah. The more dedicated and disciplined they are. And you know, that's what I am. I'm dedicated and disciplined. So
you also spend a lot of time meeting other audiences, meeting other people, and do you get stories out of that? Is that where some of your...
Well, I mean, I try not to, because I don't want to be a thief of other people's experiences. You see that all the time, and you know, and like, for instance, September 11th, since the Trade Center, the Pentagon bombings, you know, I don't know how many requests I've received to write about it. You know, I mean, there must be 10 anthologies and 50 or 60 magazines have contacted me. You know, now certainly I can have an opinion about why it happened, sure, and the response to it, yeah, in terms of policy, in terms of politics and world affairs, but you know, it's not my story to tell. You know, I watch TV and I see all these journalists and politicians and military leaders going on and on about this or that campaign, and I just want them to shut up and put on the people who actually lost lives here. You know, here and there, you know, survivors. And so, you know, I try not when I hear somebody's story or somebody tells me something interesting or amazing, I try to be content with that story, with just hearing it and knowing it and making it a part of my life in that private way.
Right.
But my public expression, I always try to be the originator. And of course you can't control that. Sometimes you're not sure where it came from. Some remembered piece of conversation or some altered memory that you think happened to you but was really somebody else's. And you do steal from your own family, certainly. I don't have any qualms about stealing from my immediate relatives, but I try not to take away from strangers.
So I'm also interested in many of the works that I've read, both the short stories and novels like Indian Killer. There's a tremendous amount of humor, a tremendous amount of sort of investigation of the interface between white and Indian lives, and often very intimate. And particularly in your most recent set of short stories.
A lot of sex.
A lot of sex. Yeah. And in interesting ways, in ways that most readers of anything Indian haven't really thought about. So I'm interested in sort of where you think that comes from, the sort of juxtaposition, the kind of...
I've had sex with white people.
Well, okay. That's, on the face of it, that makes perfect sense. But normally wouldn't interrogate that as a necessarily intellectual endeavor. But actually, it gets to my issue, and that is that is in some way what you're looking at, what you're asking about is how things that are received as sort of normal are made more interesting when they're interrogated, or what is it that...
Oh, gosh. Getting all academic on me.
It's my job.
I know, you're showing off your degrees. Interrogate. What are you, a homicide detective or a professor? I don't know. It's almost, I mean, if I want to get metaphorical, I get itches. And you scratch them, right? I'm still, in some sense, in terms of the last book, Toughest Indian in the World, which was a lot had to do with interracial relationships between whites and Indians, I'm still trying to figure that out about myself, those conflicting desires I have about whiteness. I'm married to an Indian woman, but most of the love partners in my life, in fact, 99% have been white. And most of my objects of adoration from afar have been white. And why is that?
And of course it works both ways, and you exploit it both ways.
Right. And also, in some sense, as a public figure, as a writer, as a literary celebrity in various forms, experiencing the ways in which I get objectified and I get turned into a fetish, like how I become a turquoise-laid Kachina doll, and so that always really interests me too, and the ways in which we consciously and unconsciously accept that. I'm always, I mean, in the end, everything we all do is to get laid, right? And so I wrote a book about that.
Right. I mean, again, I'm not trying not to get too academic, but there is an interesting analogy that occurs to me. I mean, we're here on land that was Kumeyaay, and that could be said anywhere in the United States. It was someone else's land. Yeah. And the way in which the 18 Indian reservations and groups here, and it's the largest number of any county in the United States, exist is in a more or less invisible state, except for in certain objectified areas like casinos and whatnot. And there is a kind of interesting analogy between the investigation of the interracial sex that you're talking about and the way in which whiteness makes Indianness invisible, yet uses all sorts of cultural and icons and ideas in its fabric. So I'm wondering whether this is a stand-in for something else, or
oh, well, I don't know. I mean, in the sense, as you ask that question, all I can think of response is, I mean, what is colonialism except the breeding out of existence of the colonized.
Right.
And how is that accomplished?
Right. And it's exactly those desires that in some sense...
Right. I mean, the most dangerous thing for Indians then, now, and forever is always going to be the fact that we love our colonizers. And we do. And we are disappearing, you know, and we will disappear. And what Indian is 100 years from now would be unrecognizable to the Indians of today.
And 100 years before compared to today as well.
So, and here in Southern California, I mean, Indian tribes are the United Nations, and virtually indistinguishable from the community at large. And more and more with every generation, the difference is purely cultural. And in fact, purely adopted cultural rather than innate culture. That the originators of the ceremonies and stories don't exist anymore, and that the direct descendant carriers of those stories and ceremonies don't exist anymore. That Indian culture has always received knowledge, and that's going to continue. Does that mean these people aren't Indian? No.
Right.
It just means the colonization is complete.
Right, but it's precisely those issues that seem to always come out of the stories, no matter how personal and how autobiographical they seem.
But the thing, and it's not just Indians either. I mean, every novel is about identity.
Right.
What does Salman Rushdie say? There are two stories: the story of home and the story of leaving home. That's all. That's all that exists in the world. And every novel, every poem, every movie is about that. And I just have an Indian spin on it, and a Spokane Indian spin at that.
Right. Well, I guess I'd like to just see, I'm always asked about Indian authors, Indian writers, both now and in the past, and I'm wondering, besides Sherman Alexie, what other young Indian artists, Indian writers would you send someone looking for, to watch out for?
Well, we all know the usual suspects, and they're all still great. I mean, I've become a usual suspect. You know, I'm bored by myself. The one book I would talk about that's coming out, I just found this out yesterday. She's been working on it for years. And last thing I heard from her, she goes, I'll never finish it, I'll never finish it. But it's coming out from Blue Hen Books. It's a division of Penguin. A novel called Perma-Red by Deb Erling. She's a Flathead Indian, Salish Kootenai, cousin of mine. And I think it's something brand new in Indian fiction. And then another writer, a Chippewa Indian named Mark Turcotte, has a new book of poems coming out soon, it's amazing. It's amazing. It's something brand new. Indian literature is still very adolescent. I mean, my family, I'm only the second generation to ever put pen to paper with any regularity. Mm-hmm. And you find the same as the case with a lot of other Indian writers. But what's happening now is for most of the century, and we've only really been engaged in what you call literature this century, most of the Indian writers have been very privileged from very academic, very upper class families. And that's changing now. That in much the same way that the beginning of literature in Europe and the beginning of literature anywhere has always been the privileged start, because they're the ones who get taught to read and write. And it starts making its way down, and it's making its way down now. And blue-collar Indians are starting to write more and more. I mean, Mark works as a as a carpenter and a logger, and so I think that's what's going to happen now. Is the literature is going to diversify because those practicing it and getting published are more diverse.
Yeah. And there clearly is an audience and a market for Indian literature, and that changes, unlike...
Yep, we can get just as ignored as every other writer of every other color.
Right, right. Well, that's interesting. I guess one might sort of end in asking you what kinds of projects you have on the table that you're excited about.
Well, our new movie, The Business of Fancy Dancing, just got accepted into Sundance, and will be premiering in January of 2002. Oh my gosh, 2002.
Soon.
Yeah, very soon. In the American Spectrum section. So it's the second movie, and we shot it on DV, and we shot it very tribally. very collaboratively, and you know, more than half the people who worked on it were women. So, you know, we tried to be matriarchal about filmmaking. So.
And another unusual practice.
Exactly. Yeah. Filmmaking is a serious boys' club, so I tried to, you know, change that a bit.
And what about the poetry championships?
I retired from
You've retired?
Heavyweight poetry bout.
You're
because
not heavyweight.
Because it was sort of a Muhammad Ali Ken Norton fight where Muhammad Ali got the decision, but he actually lost, and I was Muhammad Ali and Saul Williams was Ken Norton for this last bout. I thought he won, even though I got the decision, so I retired because I couldn't carry on morally and ethically knowing I had lost. So Saul's going to continue.
Well, that's great. And for music, are you at further musical interludes?
I'm doing everything. I'm working on 10 books, and you know, taking all my pills. So.
Well, that's great. Maybe I should get some of those pills.
You had no response to that. That was interesting. No deconstructing?
No, okay.
I've
been deconstructed completely.
Oh, okay.
That's,
okay.
I guess, the proper end of the interview. Sherman, I want to thank you very much for appearing at UCSD and Guestbook.
Well, thank you.